Okay, recording, we're sharing. Good, working. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So now we're doing experiments. So maybe, what we talked about is, for your hypothesis, is a survey the right approach, right? So you have to think about the other alternatives. The big advantage of experiments is you get to show causality in a controlled environment. So again, we're going to do what's the state of the art, what the editor's looking for, some really good examples in the top journals, and where to from here. So these two men, Kahneman and Smith, received a Nobel Prize in 2002 for their work in experimental economics. Yeah, so for experiments. And since that Nobel Prize, you're seeing more and more experimental studies in the top journals, the tier one, economics, finance, accounting, you name it. Other experimental Nobel Prizes, Roth in 2012, Ostrom 2009, and these guys in 2019. So it's a very fertile area for getting acknowledgement and prizes. So when people do capital market research, like accounting, event studies, and all sorts of capital market studies, the criticism they get is, you found an association, but you haven't shown. Okay. Yeah, how do I do that? No. Volume. Okay. So you haven't shown causation, yeah? So yeah. So, it's very hard to show causality in a capital market study. So why experiments are so well regarded is you can show it in a laboratory setting, right? Because you have a controlled environment. So you can make sure there's only one or more exogenous variables, and you can see whether that impacts the outcome variable. So, for example, in science, when they're testing a new drug, they have a treatment and a control variable, right? So the treatment is getting the new drug. The control is getting a sugar tablet. But you don't know whether you're in the treatment or in the control. So the subjects don't know. And so at the end of the trial, they can see whether it made a difference to the condition that the drug is supposed to. And that's considered as the gold standard. Obviously, you can't use the same people for treatment and control. So some people get the treatment and a random sample gets the control, or a matched sample by sex, age, health conditions, etc. So they allow you to establish causality, right? So, you can really control what's going on. So, you split the population into two groups. You have the treatment, which is the intervention. You have the control. They don't know whether they've got the intervention or not. And then you compare the outcomes. So natural experiments. So in capital markets, you have to resort to something known as natural experiments. So can strong institutions affect long-term growth, right? And so, but you can't just assign some countries to have strong institutions and others not, and then wait for 20 to 50 years to see the outcome. You just can't do that. But you do observe strong institutions naturally in some countries and weak institutions in another. So that gives you a natural experiment, yeah? For example, you can you can't divide a nation in two, right? But North Korea and South Korea exist, so you could have a look at those two. East Germany and West Germany, right? You can see under, the different conditions, whether, whether you could test the hypothesis. So, before East and West Germany were divided into two, they were the same, right? So you could say that East Germany become the treatment group, right? It was under Soviet rule, and West Germany was the control. And how did that work out? Well, it didn't work out very well for East Germany, right? So that's very interesting. And so a democratic capitalist system like the US compared to Russia, right, which is a socialist system. So that gives you a natural experiment to compare those two countries. Looks like it turned out better for the US than for Russia, right? That the capitalist system seemed to work. So there are the differences between the two. Obviously, the field experiment, the natural experiment is very realistic, whereas, the lab experiment is low realism, but it also has few other, factors that could affect it, whereas in nature, there's lots and lots of extraneous. You've got high control in the lab, low cost, short duration, and the subjects are aware. But for the field experiment, it's low control, high cost, long duration, and subjects are unaware. So again, just like survey, you need to have a hypothesis, right? You're actually testing a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that the exogenous variable, the explanatory variable, causes the outcome. So X causes Y. Then you've got to assign the subjects to receive the treatment and the control. So you can control who gets the treatment. And you measure the change in the dependent variable, and you make sure you control all the other extraneous variables. So you can do probability sampling, where it's a random sample or stratified random. You can do non-probability, like convenience or snowball, right? Snowball is where you get some participants, ask them for referrals. So sampling is important. Here's an example from the Dow Chemical Company. They come up with a new lubricant, like oil, for a boat outboard motor. And they tested it extensively in Florida, because Florida is notorious for high heat and high humidity. And it passed all the tests. Unfortunately, when they rolled it out nationwide, in Michigan, where it gets incredibly cold, the oil, the lubricant, froze in the winter and caused rusting of the engine. So they sampled in Florida, but they should have sampled across different climates. So you could assign them completely random. You could do a random block design, or you could do match pairs. So here we want to see the effect of the sleep, number of hours sleep you get versus, some standard skills. So 2 hours sleep is one group, 10 hours is another. So you could use 10 students to do the 2 hour sleep, and a different 10 students to do the 10 hour sleep. But, you might not, you could pick them randomly, but you might want to match them on sex, age, health conditions. You could do the same students 2 hour sleep, then 10 hour sleep. But because of, we worry about order effects, you might get different response, different outcome if you did 10 hour sleep, then to what you get from 2 to 10. So the order effects could be important there. So what do you use? Well, in preference, you probably divide into left and right. Skill over time, you have to use the same subjects in each experiment. Sometimes you've got a block, women in one block, men in the other. Treatment for the women, number of treatments and a control. treatment for the men, maybe a number of treatments and control. So here's blocking. You decide to either give no feedback to employees or extensive feedback about their performance. So you break up the employees into newcomers. So these might be teachers that have 1 to 2 years experience. They're newcomers. So you have some that get no feedback and some that get detailed feedback. And the current employees might be the teachers that have been there for 20 plus years. And again, you have some getting no feedback and others getting feedback. So the new teachers might have all these great ideas about making an impact, love of working for children, but the ones that have been there for 20 years plus might be very jaded and only thinking about the flexible working hours and things that they get out of it. So that's a way to do it. So then you get the effective feedback on outcomes, but you get it also, for new employees and for the existing. So a match sample is you have 10 students with 2 hours sleep, and then you don't randomly get 10 students with the 10 hours sleep, you get a match sample. So age, gender, health, could be important, normal sleeping habits. So the most common way is to divide into the treatment group and the control. There's a whole link to a whole lot of finance studies there in that link, so you're welcome to look at that. Richard Haney and colleagues looked at whether one investor was different from 2 or more. Yeah, so 2 heads better than 1. So two, and we're going to do something like this shortly. So you can also have more than one explanatory variable, right? So it can be a little more complicated. So you can manipulate, 2 or more independent variables. So here's an example. We see research that says if children watch violent cartoons, they will act out violently. Yeah? So some people think that's, I know that's not true, right? Because I have 5 children and 6 grandchildren, and they all watch violent cartoons, but they don't act out. But what is true is that kids can be cranky or happy. They can be unhappy or happy. So what they've done here in this, they watch violent cartoons versus that's the treatment, and they didn't, which is the control. And the children are unhappy, frustrated, or happy, not frustrated, right? So that's what's done. So you can compare here. Yeah, the main effects show that children that watch violent cartoons are more likely to act out than non-violent. Yeah? However, the difference between whether they're happy or not when they're watching it is bigger. That's a bigger effect. So really, the main effect I would take out of this, it's really innately about the child themselves, right? So the interaction is interesting. Yeah, there's a bit of a difference there. And so you can see there's quite a few interactions. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be just one thing that you're changing. So, you've got to be careful to control for extraneous factors, and that includes the effect of you yourself as a researcher. So there's a very famous experiment called the Hawthorne experiment. So Hawthorne is a little town outside of Chicago in the US. So the researchers went to Western Electric's factory there. So the idea was to study whether, the airflow and the lighting, whether that has effect on the productivity of the workers, right? But it turned out that they had a treatment where they had a better lighting or better airflow and control where they didn't. But it turned out they all performed better, right? And it was just a fact that someone was observing them and taking an interest in them, right? The fact that the researchers were there made them all feel good about the organisation. So whether they were in the treatment or control, they experienced better outcomes. So that's known as the placebo effect, right? If you think you're getting the drug, right, if you think you're getting the treatment drug, but you're really getting the control, you can still have health benefits, right? There's a placebo effect. So you wouldn't just do one experiment, you'd do a number because you want to get like a standard error across. You get the effects from one experiment, but then you want to get the average effect, right? And that way you could calculate the variance and calculate statistics. So even in matched pairs, the subjects aren't identical, right? So you've got to be careful with that. So internal validity, was the experiment, was that the sole course of change? Your own intervention could be there. So control groups, random assignment, and pre-post testing increase internal validity. External validity is whether the sample could, whether the experiment could be reduced, say, in another country or another time and get the same results. So some people argue that students, that's not realistic, right? That's not realistic. You'd rather get business people. But maybe you would, right? But the point is that students are very homogenous, right? In Vietnam, Australia, Russia, China, the US, right? And they're smart and they can understand, complex situations and abstract situations, right? So I guess, that actually makes them, really, really good subjects. So you can have independent trials with different participants in each. You can have repeated trials, but you've got to watch the order effect, and you can have a matched sample. So just looking at the historical origins, so Bernoulli, and you all know about the Bernoulli function, was a famous statistician, talked about experimental research. Chamberlain was a big leader, and he published a very important paper in the Journal of Political Economy, which is one of the top economics journals. And that one of the guys that got the Nobel Prize in 2002, turns out he was a student of Chamberlain, so it's got a rich history. So the issues, what can we learn from using students? What can we learn about the real world? Well, Vernon Smith, the Nobel Prize winner, has got a very good answer. The laboratory becomes a place where real people earn real money for making real decisions about abstract claims that are just as real as a share of General Motors, right? So, which is probably true. So, the students are very homogenous, they're smart, they can understand, what you're getting at the experiment. The other thing is, people say, well, it's just $50, right? It's just $50, it's not enough, they're not enough incentive. But this guy, Cameron, did a study in both Australia and Indonesia. And at the time he did the study, the Australian dollar was very strong. So the $50, which was like, paying for an hour's time in Australia, when he did the experiment in Indonesia, the $50 was equivalent to a whole month's salary. So he found, though, there was no difference in results between the subjects in Indonesia and Australia, telling you that the higher stakes didn't necessarily mean, I think you need to have some stakes, but the higher stakes, 1 month salary versus 1 hour salary didn't seem to make much difference. We talked about anchoring, that's incredibly strong bias. So much so that the US people are anchored to a government bond portfolio with a very low return for their retirement. And the Australian are anchored to a high risk the whole market exposure for their retirement, right? But that gets a very high expected return. And we know that order effects can matter. Yeah? The order of your responses can matter, the order in which you sleep. So again, we get to ethical approval, yeah, and you need to have ethical approval, certainly in Australia, if you want to do research on human subjects. So we talked about Yale and their problems, and Stanford and their problems. Now let's talk about Princeton. So in Princeton, the subjects were divinity students. So they were in the process of becoming ministers of the church, priests. So they were told, and there were three situations. They were told that they had to walk from one building to another, and when they got there, they had to give a talk about being a good Samaritan. Then being a good Samaritan is someone who stops and helps, even if it's someone's from another country, another race, even if it's there's tension between the countries. So they were told, one group was told that they had to get there quickly. It was urgent. Yeah. Another group was told that they should get there. Another group was told you should take your time. So on the way from one building to the other, the experiment was set up that someone collapses and obviously having a heart attack. Yeah. So of the people, the divinity students, mind you, they were told they were going to go from one building to another to give a speech about helping others. Only 10% stopped and helped the person. Only 10%. 90% just went on by. And the other groups was just as bad, 50%. 50% on average, right, for if you had time. So now you can imagine at the end of this that these participants felt really terrible about themselves, and doubly so because they're divinity students and they, should have been very, they shouldn't have worried about giving the speech or not. They should have worried about helping the person that needed help. So, that's obviously going to traumatize people. But it also tells you something not so good about the human condition, right? So, okay, Journal of Finance, Lucas in the Library, American Economic Review, different options, Moral Hazard, Management Science. So, these things are getting published in very, very top journals. Where to from here? Nicephorus is a very good introduction for the student. Some people said they're doing accounting, so this gives you a good review of the experiments being done in accounting. Here's something right from the beginning. So you want to run an experiment. Now what? And this one's about experimentation in economics. Yeah. And there's some very good books that talk to you about. I think there's like an R guide as well. Do I find that? Yeah, Experiments with R. That's the book by McCulloch. Okay, we're going to do an experiment. Yep, and what it is I'm going to give you $20 billion. You wrote it up. And so to fix the problems in Vietnam. So one, what are the issues? And two, how much to allocate to each. Yeah, so just give percentage. So you're being given 20 billion US dollars, right? The Rockefeller Foundation has given you $20 billion. And the idea is, let's fix the problem. Vietnam is about to come from, emerge from being a frontier economy into an emerging economy, and it'll get rapid fund flow from all the international fund managers. So, you know, you've been told to clean up everything that's needs to be fixed in Vietnam. So what are the issues? Here's 20 billion. Fix them if you can. How much would you allocate to each of these issues? So what we're going to do is, well, this experiment is about group thinking versus individual thinking. So you see these 4 people here. You will be my individuals, right? So you're not to talk about it to each other, not to look over each other's shoulders. So you come up with the issues you think that affect. You know, I couldn't do this in China. You know, if I was in China, I could not run this experiment because everyone would write that there are no issues, right? They would. Every single participant would write that there are no issues, right? So in that sense, you're a lot freer here, right? I mean, so what are the issues and how much? You can just put percentage of the 20 billion. So what we'll do is, before we hear from the groups, we want you to send your answers to Duke. On each of them a piece of paper. Yeah? Okay. Each of you get a piece of paper and you write it down. So, but don't let anyone else in that row see it. So you got 4 independent individuals, and then we'll have 4 groups, 4 or 5 groups. So the experiment is actually how different is the group thinking about this to the individual, right? So are 2 heads, 2 or more heads better than 1? So that's what the experiment is.
How many minutes they have? 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
Oh, no, they need longer. So you get 15 minutes for this. We can do it. Yeah, we can do it. Yeah.
All right. You want me to explain in Vietnamese?
Yep.
Rồi, bây giờ mình sẽ làm một cái bài tập mọi người ha. Là một cái tập gọi là experiment, thử nghiệm. Thì lớp mình sẽ chia ra làm 2. Đây là một nhóm 4 bạn. Các bạn sẽ cho ý kiến cá nhân individual. Và tất cả mọi người còn lại thì mình sẽ cho theo cái ý kiến group. Mình cũng như hồi nãy là mình sẽ chia mỗi cái một dãy hoặc 2 dãy bàn á là thành một group. Thì how many group you run, Tom? 3 or 4?
No, we got 1, 2.
So each table is one group? Too many? Each 4?
4 groups, yeah.
Yeah. Rồi bây giờ mình sẽ chia lớp mình ra thành 4 nhóm. Và mình sẽ so sánh kết quả giữa 4 nhóm đó với lại 4 cái bạn này. Thì 4 bạn này là không được copy, không được nhìn nhau, không được chia sẻ. Nói chung là phải có một cái gọi là tư duy độc lập nhé. Đức sẽ 4 bạn đó sẽ viết ra cái câu trả lời ra giấy và đưa cho Đức, và Đức sẽ đọc. Rồi còn lại 4 nhóm thì mỗi nhóm sẽ cử một cái người leader, và sau đó sẽ đại diện nhóm để trả lời câu hỏi. Thì câu hỏi của mình là nếu như bây giờ bạn có trong tay 20 tỷ đô la Mỹ, hãy tìm ra những cái vấn đề của Việt Nam và bạn sẽ phân bổ cái 20 tỷ đó cho những cái vấn đề đó như thế nào. Show the problem. 20 tỷ ví dụ như giáo dục là 1, đường xá là 2, ví dụ gì đó, thì bây giờ mọi người sẽ phân bổ, và để cho dễ dàng thì mình sẽ phân bổ bằng tỷ lệ phần trăm nha. Rồi, ok, mọi người bắt đầu. Mình có 15 phút. Một nhóm ai rồi em một nhóm. Rồi, nhóm thứ tư đây. Đây là quay cái lại. Document, I need the paper to write down the answer.
No, you got to write them up.
I write it up.
Yeah. Okay, have the individuals finished?
Yeah.
Okay, they've got to hand them to you. We'll do them last. You hang on to those. So the whole experiment is, will the groups be different from the individuals? So does group think with all of this triangulation is different from individual think? Okay, that's it. Duke, can you collect from the individuals their responses? Is that everyone? Yeah.
Was you hold it?
Yeah, well, I'll look at it. Is it in Vietnamese?
No, in English.
Okay.
They got. I asked them for the name and the
Okay.
department.
Okay, so now group one will be that behind individuals.
They say we pass the big on around it.
Oh, they already did theirs.
What?
No, on the other side. We do the other side, yeah.
Where?
No, next. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Chào thầy, chào chị. No, okay, à, à, em nghĩ là mình phân bổ 20 tỷ đó vào trong những vấn đề. Thứ nhất là giáo dục, vì hiện tại là giáo dục là một cái vấn đề mà nó cần thiết cho. One second, Tom, would you prefer them translate?
That's okay. You write up.
All right, okay, right. Education, yeah? Yes. Yeah. How much? Yeah, I do.
No, it's it. We'll get the percentage up.
Yeah.
What's the next one?
Next one. 40%. She said 40%. Yes. You want later? Yeah. Yes. Y tế. Healthcare. Yes.
Just put it up.
Okay. 30%. 30%. Phân bổ cho những cái liên quan tới là xã hội, như benefits, social benefits, những cái lợi ích về xã hội. 40%, 30%, 30%. Yes.
So good morning, teacher. So for my group, I think we will put like 30% on education.
Education.
Yes, yes, 30%. 20% on healthcare. Yeah. 20%. No, 20%. 20.
Oh, this one 40?
Yeah, it is the first, the second, and now the third is for in the. Huh? Okay. Education is 30%. 30, yes, 30%, and healthcare 20%.
20?
Yes.
Yeah.
And for industry, it's around 30% and 30%. Industry.
What industry?
Like improving like infrastructure. Yes. And the last one is service, especially tourism.
What do you mean service?
Infrastructure, how much?
What do you mean social benefit?
30%. 30%.
30?
Yes. And the last one is service is tourist.
Tourism. What do you mean?
Tourist. I mean tourist. Tourism.
Tourism.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. That is the last one.
20?
Yes, 20.
Yes.
Okay, so we make it equal for 4 segments. First is education. Yeah.
Yes.
Then healthcare and social benefits.
Health or social?
Healthcare and
L-A, so that's with the number 2.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right.
And for the fourth, climate change and environment.
So from our group, so first of all, we spend 50% on education. And the second one, 25% on healthcare. And the third one is going to be on the environment. So 25% as well. And one more thing. So no, there's one more thing I need to say. No, it's like for all of the three areas that I mentioned, we will spend like maybe 10% on each field for technology. Like
For all the 10%.
so I mean like on education, you know.
Yeah, we don't have enough time, okay? That's, yeah. Maybe I bring the paper over, it's okay. Yeah. All right, D1. Infrastructure. Another. Let's write.
Okay, next one.
Yeah.
Education,
All right.
25.
Yeah.
Health,
Yes.
25.
Yes.
Infrastructure,
Yeah.
20.
Yes.
R&D,
R&D. Yes.
20.
20. All right. Three.
Agriculture,
10. 10 for infrastructure.
Food
Food safety. Yeah. Oh, you mean the
10%.
yeah. 10?
Yeah.
All right. Give me 1 second to get another fix. Yes, I'm ready. 33.
30%.
30.
Environment, 30%. Technology, 20%.
20.
Economic system. 10%. Health, 10%.
Don't, come on. You mean people?
Sorry.
You mean people or P3? P3 on. 30, 30, 20. Come on.
13, 20, oh, sorry, 10, 10. 13, 20, 10,
30, 20.
10, 10.
So which one take? Take.
Economics, 10.
Okay. And
No.
now,
Okay.
yeah.
You're gonna have to contact.
Hello?
I've lost my vision. Sorry.
In Vietnamese, yeah. Okay. Edu.
Education.
Yeah. Edu and health. This person combined.
Fine.
Okay, 30. Then transport and infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Twenty. And phòng.
What's that?
Vâng.
Defense.
Defense. Ten. Technology, science and technology. Maybe just technology, yeah. Ten. Green economy or green energy. Environment. See, 10. And then 20, economy.
Okay. What I expected was that the groups would give pretty much the same, yeah, items and weights. And I think you did, right? The groups might have had different individual things. But I thought for the individuals, they would have more items. Yeah? And so, like a bigger variance. Bigger variance. So the groups are like snipers shooting at a bullseye, whereas the individuals are like a shotgun and pellets. Shows, yes, it shows that it's not active. It shows the difference.
The online copy.
So the experiment works because the group's very focused, laser light on the target. Individuals, all great ideas, but scattered. Yeah? Not scattered rather than the laser-like focus of. So here maybe the two heads better than one, although some of these things like defence and food safety, very important that the groups really didn't do, right? So that they're quite crucial unless you can eat. And in freedom, right, that's not very good having the other things. So like a very good experiment. So when the researchers did two traders better than one, two traders weren't better than one. So, but in this group exercise, right, for problem solving, the group was better, I think, because it was more focused. Excellent.
Thank you.
So I think that's really quite a good experiment. And it's got, it's practical for you as well to think about, what your country needs and how you'd allocate. But I don't believe I could do this experiment in China. I think one of the professors would come in and shut it down, which is also very interesting. So now we're going to page 289 of your online.
Page
289.
29.
Okay, so we're talking now about capital market studies. So this definitely quantitative. Surveys are quantitative, experiments are quantitative, and capital market studies are also. So the two men on the right, Ankrist and Embens, received the Nobel Prize in 2021 for their work on natural experiments, right? Not the experiments you do in the lab, but natural experiments, right? So things you see in society. And here's like a great video where Embens explains to his two children, who are like 12 and 10, the morning after he got the Nobel Prize, explaining why he got the Nobel Prize. And it's very, it's only like a minute or so video, so it's well worth looking at. So one of the examples is there's often talk in the Western world about giving everyone a guaranteed income, something like $25,000 a year. So the people that are in favor of it think it encourages innovation, right? Because if you don't have to worry about having a job, driving a taxi or, washing dishes, you know that you can pay your rent or your mortgage and your food, then you might be motivated, to do something really innovative, become a great musician or, start a business, So the opponents say, though, that people will be lazy. If they get the 25,000 a year, they'll get together with 4 friends, get a beautiful place to live in, right? Because they combined, they'll have 100,000 and they won't do any work. Well, in one state in the US, if you win a lottery, you don't get a lump sum, you get 25,000 a year for the rest of your life, right? Or for 20 years. And it was a very good natural experiment to test this minimum income theory, because they have this lottery every week. And it turns out that everyone kept working, right? It didn't affect them, not working at all. So, what is this endogeneity and causality, right? I noticed in New York, there's a lot of police, but there's a lot of crime. In Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, there's very few police, but not much crime. So there's an association between police and crime, right? But it's an endogenous one. Are the police causing the crime, or is the crime causing police? In New South Wales, where I'm from, there was a national, Royal Commission, and the police were actually causing most of the crime. They were integral in it. So it's not as clear cut, right? You do a regression, you see a relationship, but what's causing what? Banks might have really good capital reserves and diffuse ownerships, right? Good performance, but good performing banks might have stronger capital reserves. So athletes who are trying to run 400 meters, and the last 100 meters might, they develop lactic acid. Is the lactic acid helping or hindering their performance? And everyone used to think that it was hindering the performance. But when they studied at the molecular level, the body's performance was deteriorating, so it produced lactic acid to help, right? So there was something that was a very strong association with diminishing performance and the body's build-up of lactic acid, but it was actually to help, not to hinder. So if you just do regression, you're not going to be able to tell what's causing what. So that's important. So what the statistical fix is to use instrumental variables, right? So the instrument you use has got to be uncorrelated with the error, that is exogenous, and relevant to the potentially endogenous variable. And instead of being the regular covariance x with y over variance of x estimator, as you get for maximum likelihood, the IV estimator is covariance y with z over covariance x with z. So editors like to see that you've considered endogeneity and causality. So the first thing they'd like you to do is to conduct a test for endogeneity. And that's known as a Hausman-Wu test. And you compare the coefficients of maximum likelihood with coefficients of instrumental variables. And so if they're significantly different, you know that you've got a causality, endogeneity problem. Then they want you to test the two properties of the instruments. First, that they're correlated with the potentially endogenous variable, and you can do that using an F-test. And secondly, they're uncorrelated with the error. So then you do like an over-identified GMM test. So coming up with instruments for your IV. Some people use exogenous variables that appear elsewhere in the system. You don't get a lot of marks from the editor if you just do that. Some people use lag values of the endogenous variables. Yeah, you don't get many marks from the editor if you do that either. But here's something you'll get marks from the editor for if you come up with an economically meaningful and intuitive instrument. And, I scoured the literature and I could only find 5 of them. And there's only really one that I would hang my hat on, right? And that's the second one. So they wanted an instrument for family succession. They're looking at the effect of family succession on performance. So the instrument, wait for it, right? Wait for it, was the sex of the firstborn child of the founder. The sex of the firstborn child. So let's think about the properties of the instrument. First, it has to be uncorrelated with the error. So do you think that something random, the baby born male or female, 40 or 50 years ago, would be correlated with performance now of the firm? Well, there's no way, right? So what happened 40 or 50 years ago when the child was born can't possibly be related to the performance now. So you get that it's uncorrelated with the error. Now, the second thing we've got to show is that it's correlated with the endogenous variable. So is family succession correlated with the sex of the firstborn child? Well, yes, unfortunately, and especially in Asian countries, if the sex of the firstborn child is male, there's more likely to be a family succession, right? So that's an incredibly good instrument, even though it seems out there, right? The sex of the firstborn child. Uncorrelated with the error, because it couldn't possibly be related to performance 40, 50 years on, but definitely correlated with whether there's a family succession or not. And this guy, Casper Nielsen, the second author there, he's done some other really good studies on exogenous shocks. So, for example, to find the value of a director, what he did was he collected data on unexpected deaths of directors. So he got hundreds of these unexpected deaths. Not someone had been sick, but someone had got hit by a bus on the way to work. So unexpected deaths, or someone who went down an aeroplane. And so from that, he was able to look and find the value of a director. So let me show you why this is such a problem for statistics and econometrics. And it's got to convince you that you need to do an actual experiment, right? That you can't rely on statistics or econometrics. So here we have a trade-off for each firm. There's a frontier between performance and ownership, inside ownership and performance. You can see that firm A, it maximizes its endogenous choice at 3%. Firm B gets a maximum inside ownership performance at 7%. And firm firm C gets a maximum at 5%. So you can see there the equilibriums for each firm. And it's an endogenous choice for them, and it depends on their own individual trade-off. But, a US Senate committee requires a study to examine the ownership performance relationship. And two young scholars from Chicago go out and run, just run maximum likelihood. They don't worry about endogeneity. And they get this, it's increasing, the relationship is increasing up to 5%, then decreases, then they notice a bit of a kick up around 25%. This actually happened. It's a study by Vishna and Slater. But then and this didn't happen, the Senate says, well, obviously 5% is the optimum. Let's make all the firms have 5% insider ownership, because that's obviously the maximum. look what happens, yeah? Look what happens. You now got to look at the 5% line, and it cuts way down here. So the decline in performance is huge. And B, you got to look at the 5% line. It cuts way down here, way off the optimum. So both A and B have a dramatic fall in their performance if they're forced to have 5%. In contrast, if you've done your instrumental variables estimation right, it would just show a flat line. Because there's really nothing can be done if there's this endogenous relationship. There's nothing can be done with a cross-sectional study. That's why you've got to go on and do a natural experiment. So the two best papers in this area are both by Dempsey, a Nobel Prize winning economist. So they're well worth reading. And essentially, you need to study at a molecular level, right? A natural experiment. Coles, Lemon and Mesky did just that. They studied at a molecular level. They fitted the principal agent model and a Cobb-Douglas production function, and they found companies with the higher productivity and management input they had higher inside ownership. Companies that had lower productivity and management income, management input had lesser inside ownership. So one of the best papers here on natural experiments is Hyder and Lindquist, and they looked at debt and taxes, debt and taxes. And so this had been studied like 1,000 times before with no real resolution, just simply because you couldn't show causation. So what they did, what Hyder and Lindquist did, is they designed a natural experiment that no one had done before. In the US, there's state taxes as well as federal taxes. And the state taxes can be quite substantial, 5% up to 12%. So they looked at a whole lot of tax increases in 25 states. Remember, there's only 50 states, so it's half the states had tax increases. So about 2,000 firms over the 90s and 2000s. Then they had 67 corporate tax decreases in 29 states and nearly over 7,000 firms, and again evenly split. They did a really good job of showing that tax changes were exogenous, looking at firms in the same industry just across the state line, and they were performing similarly. They find that if taxes go up, then debt goes up, and that's what you expect. If taxes are higher, more incentive to have debt because you get a tax subsidy. But they found that the taxes went down, that the debt didn't go down. What I'd say to that is it's easy to add new debt, that is increase your debt, you just issue new debt. But it's a little harder to reduce your debt because you've issued the debt previously, and most investors hold it to maturity. They don't want you buying them out, right? So you'd probably have to wait until the existing debt you got reached maturity, and then you just wouldn't replace it. So you'd expect to see a lagged effect for a tax decrease. So it's outstanding paper, yeah? The idea is to find an exogenous event, and they found over 100. And even though there's like 1,000 plus studies on debt and taxes, this is easily the most sensible paper, shows causality, and it gives you a really good roadmap for your own research. So essentially what they're doing is a difference in difference. A natural experiment is a difference in difference. So you have the exogenous event, which is the tax change. So you have a time dummy, which is after the tax change, and a treatment dummy is those that have a tax change versus those that don't. So the regression is, of course, you have controls, but you have the dummy for time, the dummy for treatment, and then it's the interaction. What happened for treated firms after the tax change? So this coefficient B3 is the really important coefficient, the interaction. What happened to the debt after the tax change? So what Hyder and Lindquist did was, by making sure they were exogenous, by studying firms in the same industry just across the state lines, was very good. But now they'd say what you've got to do is you've got to do a parallel trends check. So before the treatment, There could be differences in the firms that get the treatment versus control, but so long as they're parallel, they can be different, but it hasn't changed before. And then you're looking for whether there's a change afterwards. And, if there's multiple time periods, the editors want you to do a staggered, what they call a staggered diff and diff, which takes account of, things might have changed in that, actually here was 2 decades, 20 years. So essentially they want you to average the effects, right? So you could either average equally across the 20 years, or you could average by the number of treatments in each year. So that's essentially what they're after. So that was okay for a while, but then the editors decided they wanted more, right? So they now refer to the natural experiment and the diff and diff as reduced form estimation, reduced, because you're just not fitting a model, you're just doing a regression. And they now want structural estimation. That is, they want you to fit a theoretical model. And if you fit a theoretical model, then you now know a lot more. You can see how things vary with the parameters. You can see if you change the parameters, what might happen. So that's what Coles, Lemon and Meskey did. They did one of the first structural estimations in this area because they had the principal agent and the Cobb-Douglas production function, and they were able to get the elasticity of managerial input. So here's an example, another lottery one. This appeared in the Journal of Financial Economics. So in this European country, you could either take a lump sum if you won the lottery or take monthly installments. Let's focus on the lump sum. So the question they wanted to answer with their natural experiment and their diff and diff is whether the lump sum, winning the lump sum, increased your participation in the stock market. So they did the diff and diff, the natural experiment, and they found, yes, it did. It increased your participation in the stock market by 12%. But of course, that's not got to be enough now to get published in the top journals. Now they had to do a structural estimation. So, if they'd just done the structural estimation by itself, it wouldn't be enough because they've done the reduced form, and so they've shown causation. So now they're just giving an idea, without the best available theoretical model, even though, this mightn't hold, right? But it's a theoretical model, which, we think of as an ideal. So they used a life cycle model. So the economic life cycle model is when you're young, in your 20s and 30s, it's very hard for you to be regarded as a marginal investor, right? It's really the people middle age and above, right? There's a very famous paper by Constantinides and the people at Chicago, and the paper's called Junior Can't Borrow, right? Junior Can't Borrow, and it's saying that the marginal investor is really the middle-aged person, 40 years or above, right? So as you go through your life cycle, you have, your different ability to invest and save, etc. So they fitted this theoretical life cycle model, taking into account what stage of the life cycle were the various winners, right? So they were able to, using the model, get the optimal actions, given the parameters, how each of the, how the outcome was driven by each of the parameters, and also think about policy experiments. What if they changed the parameters? This should all be available on the online link. So the structural models used, we already talked, the principal agent, production function that Coles used, Pan, and Zio and RFS used a production function. Whitehead, who is the editor of the Journal of Financial Economics, she uses an IO demand system that is in industrial organization. And we just talked about the life cycle model. A lot of my students do a natural experiment, and then they fit an environmental dynamics, stochastic general equilibrium model, right? That's another one. So Tony Whitehead goes around telling you this is what we are looking for, right? She goes to the Financial Management Association meetings, and she gives like a 3-hour lecture every time there's one on. So it's well worth clicking onto those, and you'll learn more than you ever wanted to know about reduced form and structural estimation. So sum up, You know, if you just got to do a statistical fit, don't do two Stacey squares. The editors think that's old fashioned now. So do GMM IV. Yeah. If you can, you know, you get marks for doing intuitive, economically motivated instruments. But as we saw, they're very hard to come up with. Definitely want to do an actual experiment with diff and diff. And if you want to get published in the very top journals, you need to add the structural estimation. Yeah.
What is structural estimation?
So you fit a theory. Yeah. So you've done a regression which shows causality.
Like structural equation modeling?
No, you fit a theory, right? Like estimating a Cobb-Douglas production function, yeah, or estimating a life cycle theory, yeah, yeah. So you're fitting a theory. If you just gone and run that theory with data, you probably wouldn't accept, you know, you'd probably reject the theory. But since you're already showing causation, now you're giving an idealized theoretical model, and you can answer the what if questions. What if you can now see ideally how the outcome varies with the parameters of the model. Yeah. So what are the editors looking for? Let's get
This is the last section.
Yep.
And this is the last section between us and the lunch.
Yeah, but it's very important. It's got to summarize everything we did. So
Yes.
this is good. This is good. So for each area, what are the editors looking for?
I think we share the screen.
Not yet, but I haven't forgotten. Are we recording?
Yeah, yeah. You want to edit it and make it as a fresh new version, yeah?
Sorry, question and answer, is that what you said?
No, I said that this one, I make the new version, a new recording.